Well, thank you, everyone. So my name is Rinaldo Brutoco. I'm very happy to be here with you today. This talk is called From Fossil Fuels to the Future. Why that's so important is because the hydrogen paradigm, which you've heard touched on briefly a couple times today, is something I'm going to go into, but I want to do it as a way of showing a path of progression of thinking that leads to the hydrogen future, which will take it out of the category of, gee, I didn't know it was right here at this time, I thought that was 20 years away, to what's happening today. And I was delighted to hear about the hydrogen backup in Ontario. So what this is about is a commitment we made, I guess it was 5 years ago now, to the state of California, the Public Utilities Commission. We said, we believe we can create an energy moonshot in California. So if you heard earlier that we have been the trend center, that is true, but what we're about to uncork is going to revolutionize the world of energy globally. And it will start here in California, it looks like. And so we made this following comment 5 years ago. We believe that we can design a system that will be 100% renewably based within 10 years or less at no additional cost to the ratepayer. Now that was such a bold statement when we made it 5 years ago. It was met initially with some humor, some skepticism, but over time, as one part of that equation kept dropping into the bucket, one after the other, what's become, what was 5 years ago looked at as a hope for idealistic outcome, is now seen as a practical trajectory towards the state going green rapidly. And now that no more peaker plants are on file anywhere in California. So we have done what Pizarro did. We've burned our ships, and now we must keep marching. And the good news is there's an enormous amount of money to be made in this march. I'm the founding president and CEO for 30 years of a nonprofit called the World Business Academy, but I'm also a merchant banker. That's my day job. And so what I've been doing is analyzing the trillions of dollars of profits that will be generated as California leads to this conversion. So let me walk you through the conversion. I want to start with the Hindenburg. Why? Because everybody gets hydrogen wrong. And everybody thinks that the Hindenburg blew up because of hydrogen, which of course is not true, because if it were true, every rocket that went to the moon would have burned up on the launch pad. Hydrogen is in fact the safest fuel known to humans. Now what's so interesting about this is most of you do not know why we were taught to believe that hydrogen was dangerous. And this is a great story of World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was aware that as the Hindenburg was coming over, and remember the Graf Zeppelin was a far less modern ship that had circumnavigated the globe several times, including the first time paid by William Randolph Hearst for the privilege of putting a reporter on board. It operated at speeds of around 85 miles an hour. It had 1.5 million miles successfully with no incident, and was far less safe than the Hindenburg. And the War Department knew that. So when Hitler sent in 1936 the Hindenburg over, instead of going directly to Lakehurst, New Jersey, he diverted the ship, which was 1,000 feet long, so think of a floating cloud. And that ship was 1,000 feet long, passing over Manhattan, 1,000 feet up in the air. So if you'd have put it on end, the Hindenburg was literally over your head like an umbrella. And on it were these massive swastikas on all the tail structures. And the message Hitler was sending is, don't get into World War II, we're the master race. Look what we can do from the sky. And it was an attempt to intimidate the US government, who was at that time about to pass the Lend-Lease Act. Well, it gets to Lakehurst, New Jersey. It's now quite clear an explosion occurred in the tail where one of the swastikas was. And rapidly, as you can see here, the explosion was in the tail, the fire starts to go completely up the envelope of the Hindenburg. Now, the speed with which the fire goes up the surface of the skin of the Hindenburg is remarkable. So much so that the thing opens like a ripe cantaloupe, and volumes of hydrogen start pouring out. Even with that amount of destruction, every single person on the Hindenburg who stayed on board walked off safely, including a couple who were 82 years old from Germany, who sat on their bunks thinking they were going to die and were able to walk off at the end. 36 people died who jumped off the Hindenburg. One person died who was unlucky enough to be standing exactly where it came down. That's all 37 deaths. No deaths from anybody aboard the Hindenburg. So why did the US government generate a massive amount of publicity over how insane it was to try and make flying ships out of hydrogen? Roosevelt knew that 100% of the world's helium supply was controlled exclusively by the United States of America. 100%. So he knew if he could convince Hitler this was a stupid technology, then Hitler would go, gee, I better take the one that's the sister ship I'm building, take it apart and turn it into Messerschmitts. So why did the Hindenburg catch fire? As probably you mostly know, the Pentagon commissioned NASA to find that answer, and the researcher, Addison, at the end of his report said, the moral of the story is don't paint your dirigible with rocket fuel. You see, what had happened was, when they built the Hindenburg, they decided they want something very stiff and very light, and so they used a form of aluminum powdered hydroxide. Now, powdered aluminum hydroxide is exactly what you make a solid booster rocket out of. So if you were Morton Thiokol and you were building the boosters for the shuttle, that's what you used. They didn't know that in Germany. They thought that because it was aluminum, it wouldn't catch fire. The truth is, powdered aluminum hydroxide, once it ignites, which it did because of the explosion, is absolutely like rocket fuel, and it just spreads like pouring gasoline on. So that's the true story of the Hindenburg. Now, just to touch on it briefly before I go to the next one, people often say to me, but wasn't that a hydrogen explosion at Fukushima? And the answer is yes, it was. And it was a hydrogen explosion in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Yes, hydrogen can be turned into rocket fuel to take a ship to the moon. In fact, there is no other way to get to the moon but using hydrogen, interestingly. And number two, the bombs that we fear, whether it's because of a blow up of a plant or because it's manufactured to blow up, occur in conditions which are so extreme that we call them hydrogen explosions, but in that particular case, it was a nuclear explosion, which generated a tremendous amount of hydrogen accidentally in a confined space, which was already on fire. Okay? So if you study any of them, Fukushima, you study Nagasaki, Hiroshima, yes, it's true, hydrogen can be a very, very deadly weapon. However, it's also the safest fuel known to man. Here's an example of, and you can see how it comes down. This is an actual fuel simulation. If you look at the two vehicles, one has hydrogen on the left, the one on the right, gasoline. And by the way, this test is identical if you use natural gas, if you use propane, if you use diesel, the test results are the same. With about 3 seconds, you'll see this large flame right there, shooting up in the air. It's not working well. To the right, you'll see what's at 3 seconds, the beginning of an explosion. At 1 minute, flame still going up. Car now exploding on the right. 30 seconds, it's completely toast. Just so you'll know, at the end of this demonstration, which was done with the same caliber rifle, the identical bullet fired at both, the internal heat of the compartment of the car with the hydrogen only went up 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the entire experiment. That's how safe hydrogen is. You can't do that with any other fuel. With whatever car you drove in here today, it doesn't work that way. So let's go to the story. And it's a great story. We want to make the plan for, we call it the California Moonshot. We want to make it zero carbon because you're never going to get to a green future if you get there by using fossil fuels. And we're committed to using electrolysis to create hydrogen from existing curtailed renewable energy. I'll show you some slides on that, which is more than enough to power this green revolution in combination with other available technologies that are economic. So we want to make it local. We believe that the grid is the enemy. You'll see a slide on this in a moment. Microgrids are the future. I live actually in an islanded microgrid at my home. I'm 100% independent of the grid. And I could make a microgrid as small as my home. I can make it for an office complex, or I can make it as large as the one we've designed for the county of Santa Barbara for 100,000 people, which stretches from Ventura up to Goleta. Why one substation at a time? Because what we don't want to do is face the day where we say, okay, turn the grid off and throw this big switch and all of a sudden microgrids go on. To the contrary, we have such an aging infrastructure that our opportunity is to continue to replace every single day all that infrastructure instead of investing in things we'll throw away soon with the new technologies that microgrid provides. And it also gives you one substation means you can literally go through an entire load pocket efficiently. We also want to maximize all the distributed energy, obviously. And we want to leverage the existing infrastructure and communities ready for change. So, for example, many of the communities in California are already, because of law, required to have 16 kilovolt transmission, local distribution lines. Many of our cities still have old 4 kV lines. The new 16 kV lines will automatically accommodate everything I'm describing today in the microgrid world. In cities like Santa Barbara, they have a kind of a combination of both. They're in the process of replacing the 4 kV lines. And in cities like Goleta, which are fairly new, it's all 16 kV now. Make it efficient. So distributed green energy saves money compared to reinvesting in decaying, obsolete, centralized energy production and transmission. You can see the economies of scale and the distributed growth to reduce energy costs for residents, businesses, and government. And you get no additional rate-paying costs for going green, which is one of the great myths we're penetrating here. People think it's going to cost us to go green. The exact opposite is true. So we see a new gold rush for investors in in-state renewable technologies, both for manufacturers, installers, obviously, service, and all of the companies that are in the periphery of the conversations we're having yesterday and today all stand to benefit enormously because they're sitting there at the threshold of what we perceive as really the next gold rush. So our goals: 100% renewable energy, zero carbon emissions, no willingness whatsoever to take a single molecule of fossil fuel ever again. Even if we wanted to, it would be insane given what we know about climate change. And we don't want to, because anything you put into fossil fuel today, you're going to rip out before its useful life has come and gone. Transportation sector electrification. Here's where hydrogen really helps. You see, 37% of all of our emissions, according to the California Air Resources Board, are from the transportation section. Can I show of hands? How many of you out here drive hydrogen vehicles? Okay, so I do, so I guess I'm the only expert. So I drive a hydrogen vehicle. I drive a Toyota Mirai, and it's a phenomenal technology. And one of the things you should know if you haven't looked at it yet, all of you, I'm going to show of hands, all of you know how server farms work, right? There's a bunch of, in effect, PCs all linked together by the hundreds. You know, everybody knows what a server farm is? Okay, and the reason you can do that is because there's no loss of efficiency when you link 2 PCs together, or 3 or 5 or 50 or 100. Hence, we've replaced all the, quote, big iron with PCs, and we are much more flexible now because we can scale it up and down as much as we want. We can add to it, we can take it away. It turns out the exact same factor is true with fuel cells. So the fuel cell in my vehicle can be daisy-chained with 100 other fuel cells, and there's no loss of efficiency when you do that. Or it can be just one fuel cell. It can be 1,000 fuel cells. So what I'm describing to you is mobile power plants. And start thinking of the implications to the transportation section when instead of taking your car home at night to charge, you take your hydrogen car home at night to run your house. Both Honda and Toyota have an attachment that fits in their bumper that will let you plug your house into your car. Now think of what that does to reduce the burden on the grid as we go through this transition. It's enormous because, as some speakers have already observed, more and more EVs coming online pushes even more responsibility out of the grid and creates more challenges. What we see hydrogen doing is the reverse. And because hydrogen is both the transportation sector and it can be used for energy production by daisy-chaining fuel cells, then you get the dual benefit of a simultaneous improvement in both transportation and energy sector for the same price, which means you've now lowered the cost and the barrier to entry in both. And if you didn't see it, by the way, 3 days ago, Toyota made a major announcement. When I first bought my first Prius, when they first came out, we didn't know if they would want to make enough of them that it would stick around. Turned out that bet paid off. The Prius became a revolutionary technology. 2 days ago, Toyota announced that they were going to mass-scale production of fuel cells, mass-scale production of fuel tanks. That's huge because it means they're going to do with the Mirai what they did with the Prius. And I think you'll see it happening by 2020 in writ large. So we want to leverage existing local distribution infrastructure in the communities, but how do we get the energy there? So I want to look at the barriers first. Intermittency. What do you do when the wind don't blow and the sun don't shine? That's one of the barriers, right? One of the things we have to deal with when we're going through renewables. What about California's decaying, obsolete, centralized grid structure, which was so easy to jerk around that when Enron did it to us, we couldn't even stop them when we found out what they were doing? And what about the risk of a single guy with a single stick of dynamite in the middle of the state blowing up a couple of towers and leaving the entire grid impaired? Choke point. What about hacking? The grid is extraordinarily vulnerable. Every government agency that studied it said there's at least 6 countries that could bring our grid to the knees if they wanted to, and the only reason they don't is because they know we can do it to theirs. So we got to end our fossil fuel addiction. We got to be willing to take the needle out. It's like heroin. You got to get off of it. There's no way you're going to do it if you say, I'll just cut my heroin dose a little. You've got to say, it's over. Fossil fuel has ended. Whether it was a good thing or not doesn't matter. It's history. What we're looking at is the future. And as a merchant banker, I'm looking at where to put my money for tomorrow, not what I made on yesterday. This is an example. California's decaying, obsolete, centralized energy infrastructure. These are plants. When you see the slides afterwards, you'll get a set if you want them. All of these plants are, in many cases, immediately need to be replaced. Some of them have a few years to go, some have as much as a decade or so to go. But basically, all that's got to be replaced. Now, if you replace all that fossil fuel crap with more fossil fuel crap, what'll happen to your bills as a ratepayer? They'll go through the moon. Because you'll end up like Toronto did, overpaying for stuff that you don't want, and now 80% of your bill is for stuff that's been decommissioned, basically. Well, as you heard from the prior speaker, David, if all you were paying was 20% of your bill, you'd be a happy camper. And that's why we don't want to replace this with fossil fuel. So we've got to integrate large renewable energy resources and do it as fast as we need to take this system down, which, by the way, I'm sure you all know, renewable resources are the quickest to come online. It's much quicker to put up a solar array than it is to build a power plant. And that number just shows you that about 19% of our greenhouse gases are from the electricity system. And the state says it will achieve the target of 33% by 2020, but whereas many thought 100% is impossible, we now know that the former head of the lead PhD, whose paper, by the way, is attached to these slides, Lorenzo Christoph, just retired in February, associate of ours. His job as the lead PhD at CAISO was to see 10 years into the future and predict where the grid could go. And Christoph and I are 100% in alignment where it's going. It's microgrids. You've been hearing about microgrids. And there's a paper that you'll see that he wrote with Professor Paul DiMartini from Caltech, and that we, the Academy, I wrote a companion paper to, which plugged the one hole that he and Paul came up with, which was porting power between discontinuous microgrids. So if you hold that question in your mind and somebody wants me to explain it more, I will. But the question they came up with is, how do you get power between 2 microgrids that might be 16 miles apart and there's no wire between them, if you're going to microgrid the whole state? And so we came up with a solution which basically uses hydrogen with a fuel cell at each site, and Paul accepted that as the answer, and Lorenzo accepted it, and so now we publish the 2 papers together, and you'll get copies of them. As well, by the way, it was a paper which we just discovered recently by Jay Keller, who was the lead research scientist at Sandia Labs until he retired a couple months ago. So the scientific community is coming along very fast now. The California Energy Commission has stated that they believe in the future of storage combined with renewables. So we're now moving into a world where it's going to happen, and the only question is how fast, by whom, and with what resources. This is, by the way, the grid that we've got now, and as you can see, because it's so long and goes down the middle of the state, it's extraordinarily vulnerable to terrorism and to, as it was, fires. For you know, the Thomas Fire was started by a grid accident. Okay, integrating large renewable energy resources. You know what the Thomas Fire was, right? It's the largest fire in the history of the state of California. And that's the one that took out Montecito eventually because of the mudslides. Integrating large renewable energy resources is costly and slow. Electricity is just, again, 19% of the greenhouse gases. So those are the targets. So what are the barriers? Well, we've talked about them. And before we invest the $5 trillion to rebuild all that stuff, pardon my French, all that crap, tied to an aging electrical grid that the conceptual framework for was created in 1880 in Manhattan. How many things in science stand still from 1880 to 2018? Here's an interesting analogy. When Alexander Graham Bell called Watson, he used the copper wire. Interesting idea, it worked, but the problem was, as long as we stayed with the copper wire, only 23% of the world's population had a phone. That didn't work. Here's what's happened. Martin Cooper, if you don't know it, that's the guy who invented the cell phone. A lot of people don't know what he looks like. So Martin Cooper invents a cell phone. And by 2010, 600 million people, today the number is 95% of the population of the planet has phone service. Why? Because we saw that the wire, which was the way we started it, was what was holding us back. When we got past the wire became, at first it was our boon, then it became our enemy. Now, this particular woman, that's an actual shot, by the way, of a woman in Africa using her cell phone to connect with a local market, as an example. So here's our decaying 19th century system. Same limitation. We've got long wires. So if you're in India or Africa and you're waiting for the wire to come, guess what? It ain't never coming. So that's why Modi of India has now built 6, and he's building a bunch more, microgrids in India at the village level. And he's spoken really brilliantly about the fact that that's the only way that we can electrify India. Oh, and by the way, we can do it and not use coal in the process, which is all 6 of those microgrids are operating without coal in a country that uses coal. Okay, we've got centralized power systems that are decayed and vulnerable. You can see how vulnerable they are. Look at Puerto Rico, it still hasn't been rebuilt. Grid disasters can plunge entire regions into darkness. You remember the great northeastern grid collapse that occurred because of one squirrel who ate the nut at the wrong time. Terrorism, of course, and cyber attacking. So let's get rid of the wire. The wire's the enemy. It did us a good thing when we needed it. Nikola Tesla, who is responsible for those wires, when he disputed with Thomas Edison the way to optimize the energy system, Tesla won that battle. It turns out Edison was right. He was just ahead of his time. So now we have solar panels and windmills that can produce tremendous amounts of electricity to the point where we're curtailing them. As you just said a moment ago, David, you can't turn your nukes off, so what do? You turn off the windmill and you turn off the solar panel. Our philosophy, our theory is the exact reverse. And by the way, the Academy was responsible, took a leading role in closing the nuclear power plant at San Onofre, and we've taken the leading role also in closing the one in Diablo Canyon. And for those of you interested, my first book on nuclear power was 20 years ago, published by Simon & Schuster as a college textbook. It's still very good and in print. The point being, nuclear is not the answer. And if anybody here thinks that nuclear is a green technology, please, I beg of you, let me send you the white paper that's the definitive examination of that question. So if anybody thinks that, please, please do ask me for that white paper. It's heavily documented, it's heavily footnoted, and it's bulletproof. And you'll be delighted to see what it says. So this is curtailment. Now this particular slide came out of a CAISO, which is the California Independent System Operators, analysis of what curtailment would be out into the future. As you can see, that's all wasted energy. This is the actual curtailment happening right now. And what it's doing is it's taking and putting a huge economic burden on people who want to buy windmills or build solar arrays, because they have to build into it enormous inefficiencies of how often they're going to get curtailed. So we have a simple solution. How do we most effectively utilize this excess electricity? What can we do with it? Well, we believe the solution is something symbiotic. Structural transition to community microgrids so we don't need those centralized power sources in the first place. Use networked community microgrids to support each other. I'll show you a slide on that in a minute. And by the way, and that's all from Christoph's work at CAISO. Storing curtailed and excess energy as hydrogen. So David Olson's presentation mentioned they have an electrolyzer up in the Arctic Circle where that plant exists, mine. And what they do is they electrolyze using electricity, excess electricity, the hydrogen, store the hydrogen, and then they use it as a fuel cell when they need it. Fuel cells, if you haven't driven a car like mine, I urge you to do so, A fuel cell is as instantaneous as stepping on the accelerator of the gasoline car you drive. In fact, if you don't lose the low setting on your car, you'll patch rubber, because an electric motor is that much more efficient than an internal combustion engine. Tiered stored hierarchy, and I want to come back to that. If there is no one storage solution for everything, all places, all times, all circumstances. Doesn't exist and shouldn't exist. Storage is a hierarchy question. There are certain things that batteries do exceptionally well, and there are certain things that fuel cells do exceptionally well. There are certain things that flow batteries do at a megawatt scale very well, and there are things that pump and store or kinetic or any one of many others, which I'll show you in a moment. All of these fit together really seamlessly if you start by asking yourself the question, what's the optimum system for the least amount of cost? It doesn't usually get asked that way, but that's always the right question. So this is whether it's utility scale, localized scale, both of them are part of what we have now come to call the hydrogen economy. 21st century to replace the 19th century. You got centralized energy production on the left, expensive, dangerous, terrorist prone, long deployment time, takes 10 years to build them. And by the way, no one's gonna put more wires up like that. Not in California. We're the people who invented not in my backyard. It's not gonna happen here. So it's like if you wait for those wires to come, you're gonna wait as long as the villages in India. On the other hand, we are already building distributed, wholly islanded microgrid systems. And those distributed, wholly integrated microgrid systems, all we had to do was figure out, and this comes from the DiMartini and Christoph paper, all we had to do was figure out, see that little blue line connecting the two circles? All we had to do was figure out what to do to connect, what's that blue line? So what's the advanced technology? Well, resilient islands of electricity as small as a building, like my house, or as large as a city, the 100,000 one we designed for Santa Barbara, withstand cyber terrorism. You can't hack them because there's too many of them. There's no centralized source. Violent storms aren't going to affect them because even if it knocks one out, it's knock the one out next door. Interesting story. San Diego had a fire. There's a microgrid operating at UC San Diego. It saves them $18 million a year in energy costs. When the fire hit San Diego a couple years ago, they were about to lose their grid because they couldn't keep it stable. They called the University of California and they said, hey, can you port us some power? Quick, we need it. And they said, all we got is about 7 megawatts we can give you. They said that might do it. They pumped 7 megawatts across the line, and San Diego never went dark. Not one blip on their grid. So it can be done. It has been done. And accumulated H2 storage allows for the transportation sector to cross-feed with electrical sector. Siting generation close to use creates energy independence and security. And local energy development creates jobs, markets for electric vehicles, energy efficiency, demand response, solar, et cetera. So this is how they look when you start networking microgrids. Notice they're different sizes, and notice how there's a green arrow between each one indicating that contiguous microgrids can easily be ported one to the other and act as a backup like San Diego did, University of San Diego, to University of California, San Diego, to San Diego Gas and Electric. Each one supports a neighboring microgrid if need be. They're modular, and if you build them around one substation, it turns out it works optimally because that's a great place to put your storage. And you've already got the land, and you've got all the distribution. So you've got local distribution, you've got storage, and you've got the ability to continue to leave the grid attached like an umbilical cord still on the baby that's been born. Before you cut it off, take your time, make sure the baby's doing fine, and then cut the cord. Hydrogen storage is the only economic system we've discovered. And by the way, I didn't start out as a hydrogen guy. My first assignment when I wrote a book 20 years ago on renewable energy was to look at peak oil, the Hubble curve. And if you go down that line and you keep asking good questions, sooner or later you get to renewables, and sooner or later you get to hydrogen. And that's the only one we've found. Nothing else seems to work that we can discover. So California's tomorrow, it looks like this. Microgridded. No long, stringy grid down the middle of the state. Community microgrids for anywhere from, we think, to 10 to 50,000 residents would be optimized, and again, would fit nicely with local substations. All energy locally generated, plug and play integration, because all this stuff can be mass produced and plugged in, literally. Modular incremental implementation means little to no risk in transition. Renewable green systems go zero GHG emissions immediately, and 100% or more of the energy used in California can come from these renewables. How do you get to the hydrogen? Well, this shows you very quickly. Excess electricity currently being curtailed and wasted. Wastewater. So we've done a theoretical calculation. I'm pretty sure it's correct. I've had Hydrogenics, by the way, verify this. We work with them. I can use, in a state like California where water is a problem, I can use the output of any California wastewater treatment plant for my water. In other words, I can take sewer water and turn it into gold. Think about that. We didn't know that the water we were pushing through our plants could be used to create our energy. So we electrolyze it. It comes out as H2 gas. That happens to be an actual tanker. That's the Titan tank, which holds, about 10,000, I think it holds about 10,000 kilograms of hydrogen at a 10,000 PSA pressure. And the reason for 10,000 PSA is that all the car companies have now agreed 10,000 is the standard. So all car tanks, all truck tanks, bus tanks, all going 10,000 PSI. So here's the potential. To function as a peaking resource, batteries must be able to store adequate energy and be dispatched on demand. Good that they do that. But what happens if the sun doesn't shine for a week, as has happened? Energy storage potential increases with increasing PV penetration, but again, you got to be able to hang on to it for a long time. Hydrogen can be stored virtually indefinitely and used in any amount you want with instant spin up and spin down characteristics because of the fuel cell. All we're talking about here is once we go past taking the curtailed photovoltaic and wind resource, we believe, and I think the comment was made earlier today, we believe that the future model is something where the storage and the source are co-located. So we're looking at a wind farm that wants to be constructed, and what we're doing is offering to buy all the excess electricity that will be curtailed from the utility at a deep, deep discount, because at that point it's free to us, it's free to them. And by locating the hydrogen facility there, we actually create the hydrogen that can be used anywhere in the system. This just shows you the capacity credit storage. So the ability of a resource to provide energy during peak periods. And if we go through this, now I'm not going to go too far into it. What the blue line is, what do you get for 2 hours? What do you get for 4 hours? You get 6 for 8. You have to, when you blend storage, you've got to look at the amount of time you can hold that storage. That's the key. And so what we've come up with is something like, of course, that's the hydrogen line, right? This is the grid I wanted to show you. If you look at all the various storage, and it might be hard to read, but again, we'll pass out the slides. Every storage technique is on there. And what we're doing with that is we're showing duration, response times, and what we'd be happy to do is to break that down, and I'm being assisted in putting these slides together and today with Bob Perry, our Director of Research back there, who's doing double duty on the AV. Bob and I would be happy to break this down for you to any single technology you want to know more about. So, and this, by the way, is the CAISO curve that shows local conditions. Everything above that line, red line, should have been electrolyzed, period, end of statement. It's wasted otherwise. And now we're looking at the feedstock, curtailed energy, long-term energy reserve for the system, reliability and resiliency, all comes from hydrogen. Fuel linking stationary and transportation sectors, again, fixing a problem in transportation simultaneously with fixing a problem in electricity. Why? Because as you're creating more and more hydrogen in the years ahead, you've got a completely wide open market in the transportation section. Meaning, we're selling Mirai cars and Honda cars every day. The Clarity is a hydrogen vehicle. Hyundai sells one. And there's a big announcement, which we'll show you here in a second. So you get to sell the excess hydrogen you don't need for your electrical system if you get too much of it, straight into transportation where it sells for a premium right now. Conversely, as you keep making more and more of it, you will not only have more cars on the highway, but you'll have more and more fuel cells operating in conjunction with microgrids. And again, what we love about it is the modularity. We love the modularity. It leads to optimizing the deployment and scaling over time. So this is and take a look at this when you get a chance to look at the slides. It's too hard to read from where you are. But what this does, it shows all the integration elements from where we are today with the grid in the red and where it's going in H2 in the future and how these integrated elements are interrelated. So here's an interesting one. So upper left-hand corner, that's my car, the blue one, the Mirai. The red one above it is the Honda Clarity. The bus below that is the hydrogen fuel cell bus that's been operating, a fleet of them in Emeryville, California for years now. The medium-duty truck was on the market some time ago, and the real surprise is in the lower right-hand corner. So that blue semi-truck was just released by Toyota. It uses 2 Mirai fuel cells. It's on the road. It's the answer the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles thinks to their pollution problem. So there's a contract now for 50 of those trucks. This thing can pull whatever a semi-trailer can pull, but it does it with 2 very small fuel cells. And it's here today. This just shows you the comparison, and it's a very bad comparison. Battery electric buses in Los Angeles have been in a very unfortunate detour. And this slide, if you look at it carefully, will show you how much better they've done with Emeryville fuel cell buses. It's not even a close call. So just if you look at stalls, stops, breakdowns, useful life, it all falls apart. And this just shows you, and Ballard is the source of this, that we now have all of these. So we have a tremendous number of forklifts that operate on hydrogen. Show of hands, everybody know why they use forklifts? Do you know why? Okay, forklifts are the #1 use for hydrogen because you don't have to plug them in overnight. So you don't need to have one set of forklifts at night and one set in the daytime. You just switch out the tank. So with half the forklifts you would need in any commercial application, they've caught on very widespread now. Forklifts are a big application. Obviously cars, we have, 3,000 or 4,000 right now in California growing every day. You know about the buses and you know about the long-term, the trucks. And what you see on the far right is some innovative technologies that within probably 2 years or 3 years you'll see in local transit. Okay, I'm going to end with this. I'm going to show you Santa Barbara, California, beautiful place. Everybody likes to come visit. And here's what happened. It's in need of distributed energy desperately. It's been designated, and I've had a meeting with the just recently passed president of the PUC on this subject. It's the most at-risk community in California for a spontaneous cutoff of complete electrical power, which would drop us, well, not complete, which would drop us from 250 to 300 megawatts down to about 66 megawatts because there is one little feeder line on the bottom. This shows you I hope I can get this pointer to work. This shows you this long line right here. It comes out of Ventura. By the way, that's where the Thomas Fire started, right there. All of this is in inaccessible terrain. Southern California Edison, in a filing which we discovered in 2012 and again in 2014, basically told the state of California, these wires are coming down, we cannot even maintain them. We can't tell you when they're going to come down, but we're going to tell you that a fire is going to take them out or erosion is going to take them out with water. So we're just putting you on notice. It's not our responsibility. We warned you, do something. And then they made a proposal. And they said that they would be willing to solve the problem if the state of California would allow them to put high-powered transmission lines along the beaches to reach Santa Barbara. You can imagine how far that idea went. And it was laughable because Edison knows they cannot not only can they not maintain that, this is by the way, that injection point is Glen Annie substation up in Goleta. They know they can't maintain that and they haven't got a solution, which is why we got into microgridding. So, constraints, one of them is we have 2 utilities in Santa Barbara. We're the county where PG&E is in the north part of the county and Edison's the south. And where we inject at Glen Annie is the furthest on the line. It's the end of the extension cord from Edison, but it's 16 miles south of where PG&E starts. That's the problem. No secondary transmission is really available for North County. Linking the two is not practical, and they tell me politically impossible. There's no backup substation lines other than about 66 kW, which Edison says they could goose a little bit, but we're going to be 100 to 150 megawatts short when those lines come down, which would be catastrophic to a town like Santa Barbara with the whole world watching. And the primary and backup lines run coterminously, so for 15 miles, if that's where the break is, they both go down, the backup and the primary. We're in a conversation with Edison about all that. Now I want to show you something else. Okay, this is the Thomas Fire. This is going to be where I'm going to end the presentation. Thank you for your patience. This is the Thomas Fire. Everything in red has been designated non-buildable in the future. In blue is buildable if you can solve the electric problem, meaning the city and the county cannot guarantee services. Why? Well, to give you some idea, in that fire, the pumps, first initially for the fire hoses, became inoperable because they couldn't get electricity. Number two, that same location there where the firehouse is where the electricity is to drive the sluice gates, which should have shut the reservoir, saving 900,000 gallons of water from hitting Montecito, together with the amount of rain. This is why there's $2 billion worth of class action litigation today against Edison, by the way. Now, what do you do with that? It's the largest wildfire in California history, but we say that not only could have been avoided, it should have been avoided. And how are we going to do it? Because California's climate future dictates it. So our partners, Clean Coalition, Craig, and the Academy have developed and donated to the city of Montecito an outline of how to create microgrids that would keep Montecito running even in the event of power cutoff. And per Edison's request, and for some of the residents there, the first of the two is actually at the fire station. So the upper village, it's called, is where the first of the two would go. The bottom one is the Coast Village Road properties. So what are the economic opportunities? Obviously, I called it a gold rush. You know what that means. Local energy production will lead to innovation, entrepreneurship, job growth. And one more thing it's going to lead to, we desperately need. We have got to get you know what Moore's Law is, right? Every 18 months to 2 years, technology doubles. It's been going on for 30 years. One of the things we haven't done with electrolyzers in 100 years is mass produce them. No innovation at all, virtually. So what we need to do is we got to start making so many electrolyzers that the cost plummets like it did with windmills and solar. Even with today's costs of electrolyzer technology, which is over 100 years old, it turns out we can produce hydrogen today for a car, for example, at a price of somewhere between $8 to $10, about $8 a kilogram. And $8 a kilogram is $4 a gallon for a car. And there are statistical analyses that have been done. Sandia Labs did one, saying that number is going to come down to probably $3 a gallon once we get into mass production. And that, again, that study is part of what we'll hand out. So the capital markets are ready to fund renewable energy projects. I get a call, once every day probably, for somebody looking for an opportunity to invest in renewable energy, or someone who's got a renewable energy project that wants an investor. So the capital markets are ready. Regulators are starting to get ready, which really shocked me. I mean, we've been fighting this battle for 5 years, and now it's sort of like we're on the home team all of a sudden, which feels great. And last but not least, we believe that strategically located electrolysis plants located near areas of excess renewable energy can manage not only California's curtailment problem, but do it with valuable long-term storage reserves. And that's we believe that what we've designed for, in this case, Montecito in the crisis, is good globally. It's a first way to get integrated 100% renewable microgrid systems. This is what Modi is now building in India. We believe that the hydrogen-enabled microgrids, which he's not building in India, but we believe hydrogen-enabled microgrids will integrate with existing energy systems, so we'll have a smooth transition. And we believe that this solution, coupled with pioneering leadership and investment, can catalyze unimaginable growth in the advanced energy industry and the global energy economy as a whole. So we believe at the World Business Academy that this is the solution to move humanity to the next energy paradigm. Welcome to the hydrogen economy. Thank you. These are the three papers I mentioned. If you get a copy of the slides, you'll be getting this. So the first one by Christoph and DiMartini, you can see was published at Caltech. Mine on fuel cells and microgrid management that goes with that paper, and the one that came out of Sandia. And actually, that's NREL, and then Sandy's the last one, Joe Keller. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this presentation. For more information, or to learn more about the subject, please contact the World Business Academy.